The first bullet point of the day was always the same: survive. Ilara Vance stared at the ceiling of her cramped studio apartment in a less-than-fashionable corner of Philadelphia, where a persistent water stain was slowly mapping an unknown continent. She was 24, but her bones felt 64. An ache settled deep within them from the double shifts, the constant worry, and the weight of a world that seemed designed to press down. Her brother Michael's smiling face looked out from a cheap frame on her nightstand. He was 17, all lanky limbs and a grin that could charm the birds from the trees. He also had a heart that was failing him, a ticking clock that echoed louder than the faulty plumbing in her walls. The experimental surgery he needed wasn't just expensive. It was a figure so astronomical it felt like a joke, a number with more zeros than she had ever seen in one place. So she worked. She served coffee and cleared plates at the Gilded Spoon, a respectable but unremarkable bistro that straddled the line between the city's financial district and its more historic, tourist-trodden streets. She pushed herself out of bed, the floorboards groaning in protest. Her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror was a stranger she knew intimately, eyes shadowed with fatigue, hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, a face that had forgotten how to hold a genuine smile for itself. Just one more day, she whispered, the mantra a threadbare blanket against the cold. One more day. And maybe. She never finished the thought. Maybe was a luxury. The Gilded Spoon was already humming with the low thrum of morning prep when she arrived. Maria, the head chef, whose forearms were a road map of old burns and new ambitions, grunted a greeting from over a sizzling pan. "You look like death warmed over, Vance. Your brother?" "He had a rough night," Ilara said, tying her apron. It was a half-truth. Every night was a rough night. "That boy has the heart of a lion," Maria said, flipping an omelette with a flick of her wrist. "The rest of him just needs to catch up." Ilara managed a weak smile. It was the best she could do. She spent the morning in a blur of motion: coffee, toast, endless refills, the polite, empty chatter of the breakfast rush. She was good at her job. She was efficient, observant, and had a knack for de-escalating tension. Her father, a cop who'd died in the line of duty when she was 15, had taught her that. "Look at their hands, Ellie," he'd say. "Watch their eyes. Most people don't want to fight. They just want to be heard." She'd once calmly talked down a furious customer who was screaming about a piece of eggshell in his frittata, her voice so steady and reasonable that he'd ended up apologizing and leaving her a $50 tip. It was a small, strange skill, but it was hers. The lunchtime crowd was a different beast. Suits and ties, sharp-edged conversations about mergers and markets, people who saw her as part of the furniture. It was just after 1 o'clock, the peak of the rush, when they walked in. He was a man carved from granite and ambition, his suit a shade of charcoal that probably had its own name and cost more than her brother's last hospital stay. He was tall, with dark hair just starting to silver at the temples, and a face that wasn't handsome so much as it was commanding. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were the color of a winter sky, a piercing, intelligent gray that swept the room not with curiosity, but with assessment. He was cataloguing, analyzing, consuming. Clinging to his hand was a small boy of about 6 or 7, with the same dark hair but wide, anxious eyes. He clutched a tablet like a shield, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The man's attention was on his phone, his thumb scrolling relentlessly, while the boy seemed to shrink, becoming smaller and smaller in his father's formidable shadow. "Table for 2? Ilara asked, her professional smile clicking into place. The man looked up from his phone, and those grey eyes landed on her. For a split second, she felt transparent, as if he could see the unpaid bills and the gnawing fear right through her skin. "Yes," he said, his voice a low baritone accustomed to command. "Somewhere quiet. My son. He doesn't do well with noise?" The boy, Leo, didn't look up from his tablet. Ilara's heart gave a small, familiar pang. She saw a different kind of pain in him, not physical, but the quiet ache of a child who feels invisible. "I have the perfect spot," she said, her voice softening. She led them to a booth in the back corner, a small alcove that was usually her least favorite section because it was so far from the kitchen. Today it felt like a sanctuary. As they sat, the man, Julian Croft, she would later learn, was immediately back on his phone. Leo's world remained confined to the glowing screen in his hands. Ilara watched them for a moment, a tableau of modern disconnect. "Tough level?" she asked, nodding toward the tablet as she placed menus on the table. Leo glanced up, surprised to be addressed. He shrugged. "It's okay." "My brother plays that one," Ilara said, leaning against the adjacent table. "He says the Crystal Caverns level is impossible without the Sunstone Amulet. Did you find it yet?" Leo's eyes widened slightly. "You know about Crystal Caverns?" "Michael, that's my brother, is an expert. He says the trick is not to fight the shadow goblins, but to distract them with the glowing moss." For the first time, the boy set the tablet down on the table. "Really? I've been trying to fight them." "Waste of energy," Ilara said conspiratorially. "They just respawn. You got to be smarter than them." A small, genuine smile touched Leo's lips. "Wow. Thanks." From across the table, Julian Croft lowered his phone. He was watching the exchange, his grey eyes unreadable, but filled with a startling intensity. He had seen her, really seen her, do something he had failed to do all day, connect with his own son. "I'm Ilara," she said, straightening up. "I'll be taking care of you. Can I get you something to drink?" "I'm Julian," he said, the name offered with a slight hesitation, as if he wasn't used to giving it. "And this is Leo. Water for me. And a lemonade for him." As she walked away, Ilara didn't see the way Julian's gaze followed her, a flicker of something, guilt, curiosity, in his expression. She didn't know that Julian Croft was the CEO of Croft Enterprises, a titan of private equity known for his ruthless efficiency. She didn't know that he was in her restaurant not for lunch, but for a final reconnaissance mission before launching a hostile takeover of the entire city block, a project that would see the Gilded Spoon and a dozen other small businesses bulldozed to make way for a sleek, soulless glass tower. She didn't know that his ex-wife had custody of Leo, and that these stilted weekend visitations were his only chance to be a father, a role he was failing at spectacularly. All Ilara knew was that she had made a sad little boy smile. In her world, that was a victory worth celebrating. She added an extra maraschino cherry to his lemonade, a small act of rebellion against the greyness of the day. But fate, indifferent to the plans of billionaires and waitresses alike, was about to tear the afternoon apart. The calm shattered when the door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that silenced the restaurant. The man who stumbled in was a spectre of desperation. He was young, no older than her, with wild, terrified eyes swimming in a face pale with sweat. His clothes were worn, his hands trembled, and in one of them he held a gun. It was cheap and old, but it was real. "Nobody move!" His voice was a raw, cracking thing, high with panic. "Empty the register! Now!" The bistro froze. A collective, silent gasp. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations died. Maria froze by the kitchen pass-through, her face ashen. For 3 heartbeats, Elara was paralyzed by pure animal terror. Her mind screamed, "Run, hide, get down!" Then her father's voice cut through the noise, calm and clear as it was in her memory. "Stay calm, Ellie. Read the situation. Don't react. Act." She saw it all in a flash. The gunman wasn't a professional. His stance was wrong. His grip on the weapon was shaky. His eyes darted everywhere, not like a predator scanning for threats, but like a cornered animal looking for an escape. He was scared. More scared, perhaps, than anyone else in the room. In the back booth, Julian Croft had moved with terrifying speed, pulling a stunned Leo behind him, his body a shield, his face a mask of cold fury. "Sir," Elara said, her voice impossibly steady. It seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. "Okay, we can do that. Let's all just stay calm." The gunman's wild eyes snapped to her. "You, get the money." "I will," she said, taking a slow, deliberate step away from the booth, drawing his attention. "I will. Can you just tell me what's wrong? You look like you're in trouble. Maybe we can help." It was a gamble, a massive one. But her father had always said that giving a desperate person a chance to be heard was like opening a pressure valve. "You can't help," he sobbed, and the sound was horrifying. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "My daughter. She's sick. The medicine. It costs so much. I lost my job. I tried everything." A wave of dizzying, sickening empathy washed over Elara. She knew that desperation. It was the taste of her own life, the constant companion in her quiet apartment. "I understand," she said, her voice soft, with a truth that resonated in the terrified silence. "I really do. My brother is sick too. The bills, they never stop, do they?" For a single, fragile moment, something shifted in the gunman's eyes. A flicker of connection, a sliver of shared humanity. He was no longer a monster with a gun. He was a young man drowning, just like her. And then a fool tried to be a hero. A man in a pinstripe suit, probably one of the executives from the lunch rush, lunged from a nearby table. "I've got him!" he yelled. It was the worst possible thing he could have done. The gunman spun, startled, his finger tightening on the trigger. There was a struggle, a shout of pure panic, and the gun went off. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening explosion that seemed to suck all the air from the room. Time didn't slow down, it fractured. In one shard of a second, Elara saw the bullet's path. It wasn't aimed, it was wild. A stray shot arcing directly toward the back corner booth, directly toward the space where a little boy was cowering. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the options. She simply moved. It was a primal, unstoppable instinct. With a cry that was torn from her throat, she launched herself sideways. She didn't try to block the bullet. She didn't have time. Instead, she slammed into the heavy oak table, shoving it with every ounce of her strength. The table skidded, a precious 2 feet across the tiled floor. Leo, who had been directly in the bullet's path, was now shielded by the solid wood. The bullet, meant for his small body, tore through the plush upholstery of the booth where he had just been sitting. Elara's momentum carried her forward. She crashed to the floor, her head cracking against the leg of the table she'd just moved. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of screaming, shouting, and a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She heard the thud of the gunman being tackled by the kitchen staff, heard Julian Croft's voice, roar with terror, screaming his son's name. "Leo! Leo, are you okay?" A small, trembling voice from under the table. "Daddy! The lady!" She pushed the table. Then Julian was there, on his knees, his face white, pulling his son out from under the table, his hands checking him everywhere for injuries that weren't there. Leo was crying, shaking, but he was alive. He was untouched. Julian's frantic gaze lifted and met Ilara's. She was slumped against the booth, dazed, a sharp, throbbing pain blooming at the back of her skull. She saw the moment he understood, the trajectory, the timing, the impossible, split-second action that had saved his son's life. "You," he breathed, his voice choked. "You saved him." "He's okay," she managed to whisper, the words thick on her tongue. "The boy is okay." The ringing in her ears grew louder, the edges of her vision blurring into a dark tunnel. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was Julian Croft's face, the cold mask of the CEO shattered, replaced by an expression of raw, disbelieving awe. And then, silence. The first sensation was beeping, a steady, metronomic pulse that was too sterile for her apartment, too rhythmic for the city. Hospital. Her brain supplied the word through a thick fog. The second sensation was a dull, pounding ache at the back of her head. Concussion. The fog thickened. The third sensation made no sense at all. It was the low murmur of voices, deep and serious, the scent of expensive cologne and wool suits, the palpable weight of power in the air. She felt like she was in a boardroom, not a hospital room. Ilara forced her eyelids open. They felt like lead shutters. The fluorescent lights above were merciless, and she blinked, trying to bring the scene into focus. She wasn't in a boardroom. She was in a private hospital room that was larger than her entire apartment, and it was filled with men. There were at least 20 of them. They stood in a loose, intimidating semicircle around her bed. They were all ages, but they shared a uniform of bespoke suits, silk ties, and an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. They looked like the kind of men who didn't visit hospitals. They owned them. And standing at the foot of her bed, his expression a storm of exhaustion, relief, and something she couldn't name, was Julian Croft. Beside him, holding his hand tightly, was Leo. "She's awake," someone murmured. Julian stepped forward, his grey eyes locking with hers. "Ilara." Her throat was sandpaper. What happened?" she rasped. "You've been unconscious for 2 days," Julian said, his voice rough. "You have a severe concussion and 3 cracked ribs from hitting the table, but you're going to be okay." 2 days? The word sent a jolt of panic through her. "My job. Michael. I need to call my brother." "Everything has been taken care of," Julian said quickly. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Your manager has been informed. Your brother has been told you had a minor accident and that you're fine. He's with a nurse I hired to stay with him. Please don't worry about anything." The sheer efficiency of it was staggering. He had managed her life while she was asleep. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing as pain shot through her side. Her eyes scanned the silent, watching men. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who are all of you?" A heavy silence filled the room. Julian glanced back at the assembly, then met her gaze again. There was a flicker of something that looked like shame in his eyes. "This is the board of directors for Croft Enterprises," he said quietly. "My partners. They wanted to meet you." An older, silver-haired man stepped forward. His face was grim, but his eyes held a grudging respect. "Miss Vance, I am Harrison Thorne, lead director. We came here to verify the reports and to extend our gratitude. You saved the life of this company's heir." The words were cold, transactional. The heir. not the boy. Ilara looked at Leo, who was staring at her with wide, solemn eyes. He let go of his father's hand and took a hesitant step closer to her bed. "You are like a superhero," Leo whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You pushed the table like bam!" A faint smile touched Ilara's lips. "Just glad you're okay, kiddo. We have, of course, taken care of all your medical expenses," another board member said, a man with a ruthlessly sharp jawline. "And we've established a fund for you, a compensation package for your bravery and the trauma you endured. The amount is substantial." Ilara stared at him, the fog in her head slowly clearing, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. A fund, a compensation package. They were trying to buy her heroism, to file it away in a ledger and close the book. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Harrison Thorne's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry?" "I didn't do it for money," Ilara said, her gaze sweeping over their expensive suits and incredulous faces. "I did it because he's a child, and his father was scared. I did it because it was the right thing to do. You can't put a price on that. Trying to do so just makes it cheap." The silence that followed was thick with shock. These men were not accustomed to being refused, much less lectured by a waitress in a hospital gown. Julian Croft watched her, and for the first time since she'd woken up, a genuine, unforced expression crossed his face. It was a look of profound, staggering respect. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder, and addressed his board without looking at them. "Gentlemen, I believe Miss Vance has made her position clear. Thank you for coming. You may go now." It was a dismissal, absolute and final. After a moment of stunned hesitation, the suits began to file out, murmuring amongst themselves, their powerful aura deflating under the quiet dignity of a single young woman. When the room was empty, save for the three of them, Julian pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down. He looked older than he had in the restaurant, the lines around his eyes etched deeper. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice low. "For them. For all of it. They don't understand." "They see the world in dollars and cents," Ilara murmured, her head throbbing. "I used to as well," he confessed, and the admission seemed to cost him something. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Ilara, there's something you need to know. The reason I was at the Gilded Spoon, it wasn't just for lunch." She waited, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. "My company. We owned the debt on that entire block," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "We were days away from foreclosing. The plan was to demolish everything, build a new corporate tower." He finally looked at her, and his grey eyes were filled with a self-loathing that was raw and real. "I was there to do a final survey before we flattened the place. Your place of work, the place where you saved my son's life." The confession hung in the air, uglier and more violent than the gunman's cheap pistol. He was going to destroy her livelihood, her only means of keeping her brother alive. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. But she didn't laugh. She looked at his face, at the genuine torment there, and at the small boy who was now leaning against his father's leg, watching her with worried eyes. She was tired, too tired for anger. "Are you still going to do it?" she asked, her voice flat. "No," he said, without a second of hesitation. "No. I called my office from the emergency room. I killed the project. The block is safe. I'm selling the debt to a community trust at a loss. My board thinks I've lost my mind." He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Maybe I have, or maybe I'm just starting to find it." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before he seemed to think better of it, and drew back. You saved my son, Elara. And in doing so, you may have just saved me from myself. Gratitude doesn't even begin to cover it. I owe you a debt that I can never repay, but I am damn well going to try." Elara looked at this powerful, broken man and his quiet, anxious son, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. The simple bullet point of her day, survive, had just become infinitely more complicated. Recovery was a slow, frustrating dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Julian insisted she move from the hospital into a quiet, furnished condominium he kept for visiting executives. She fought him on it, her pride warring with the stark reality that she couldn't climb the 4 flights of stairs to her own apartment, let alone work. She finally agreed, but only on the condition that she would pay him rent as soon as she was back on her feet. He'd smiled at that, a strange, sad smile, and agreed to her terms, though they both knew it was a fiction. The condo was a world away from her own. It was all clean lines, muted colors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning, panoramic view of the city she had only ever seen from street level. It felt like living in a magazine. It felt like a cage. Julian became a constant presence. He brought groceries, cooked surprisingly good meals, and handled the endless stream of insurance and medical paperwork with a ruthless efficiency that was both terrifying and a profound relief. He and Leo visited every day after school. They would play board games or watch movies, and during those hours the sterile condo almost felt like a home. Elara saw the change in him. The hard edges were softening. He started leaving his phone in his briefcase during their visits. He learned to listen, not just to her, but to his son. He asked Leo about his day, about his friends, about the game he was playing, and he waited for the answers. Leo, in turn, began to blossom. The anxious, hunched-shouldered boy was replaced by a child who laughed freely and who had started to initiate conversations with his father. Leo adored Elara. He would bring her drawings from school and tell her his secrets. He'd discovered her little secret hobby, a collection of well-worn botany books she'd brought from her apartment. Her father had been an avid gardener, and he'd passed the passion on to her. It was her one escape. "You like plants?" Leo had asked one afternoon, pointing to a book on native Pennsylvanian ferns. "I love them," Elara had said. "They're quiet and they don't ask for much, just a little light and water, and if you give them that, they give you back something beautiful." The next day, Julian arrived not with groceries but with pots, soil, and a dozen small plants. Leo thought the balcony looked lonely, he said, a faint blush on his cheeks. Tears pricked Elara's eyes. It was the kindest, most thoughtful gesture she had received in years. Together, the 3 of them spent the afternoon creating a small container garden on the balcony. As her hands worked the soil, planting lavender and rosemary and tiny, hopeful tomato plants, Elara felt a piece of herself she thought was long dead begin to stir. Their conversations deepened. She told him about her father, about his quiet strength and his love for the city he'd sworn to protect. She told him about Michael, about the terrifying fragility of his health and the fierce, protective love she felt for him. Julian, in turn, opened up about his own life. He spoke of a lonely childhood, ruled by demanding, emotionally distant parents. He spoke of his marriage to Catherine, a woman from the same rarefied world, a union that had been more of a merger than a romance, and its bitter, protracted collapse. "Catherine thinks I'm a machine," he said one evening, staring out at the city lights. "A money-making machine. And for a long time she was right. I thought if I built a big enough empire, I would be safe, secure. But I was just building taller walls around myself. The day of the shooting, when I saw that gun pointed at my son, all the walls came down. None of it mattered. The money, the company, the deals. It was all just noise. He turned to her, his grey eyes dark with emotion. You, in that moment, were more real than anything I've built in my entire life. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, but just as the silence stretched into something charged and meaningful, the world intruded. It arrived in the form of a woman who moved as if she owned the very air she displaced. Eleanor Croft, Julian's mother, appeared at the condo door one afternoon, unannounced. She was a vision of old money and surgical precision, from her perfectly coiffed silver hair to her alligator skin handbag. Her smile was a work of art, beautiful and entirely without warmth. "So you're the little waitress?" she said, her eyes sweeping over Ilara's simple sweatpants and t-shirt with thinly veiled disdain. She glided into the apartment, her gaze cataloguing every detail. "Julian has been quite taken with your story. It's very dramatic." "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Croft," Ilara said, her hand instinctively going to the fading bruise on her temple. "I'm sure it is," Eleanor said, her voice like chilled champagne. "I've come to deliver this." She placed a heavy cream-colored envelope on the coffee table. "It's from the Croft Family Foundation, a check for a very generous amount. We feel it's the most appropriate way to conclude this unfortunate business." It was the board meeting all over again, but this time it was personal, intimate, and infinitely more cruel. "I've already told your son I don't want any money," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Oh, I'm not my son," Eleanor said, with that razor-thin smile. "Julian is sentimental. It's his one great weakness. He sees a damsel in distress and feels compelled to play the knight. But I am a pragmatist. I see a young woman from a difficult background who, through a stroke of remarkable luck, has found herself in a position of influence over a very wealthy, very guilty man." She leaned in slightly, her perfume cloying and expensive. "Take the check, dear. Pay for your brother's surgery. Get yourself a nice little house somewhere, and then disappear. It's the best thing for everyone. You don't belong in our world. You can't possibly understand the stakes." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, designed to wound, to remind Ilara of her place. But as she stood there, facing this cold, formidable woman, Ilara didn't feel small. She felt a surge of anger so pure and clean it burned away her fear. It was the anger of her father, who had stood up to bullies his whole life. "You're right, Mrs. Croft," Ilara said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made Eleanor's smile falter. "I don't understand your world. I don't understand a world where a child's life is unfortunate business. I don't understand a world where a person's first instinct is to write a check instead of offering a hand. The only stakes I understand are a boy's heart beating in his chest and a brother who deserves to live. And those aren't for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone." She picked up the envelope and held it out. "I think you should go now." For a moment, Eleanor Croft looked genuinely shocked, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken back to her. Her face hardened, the mask of civility dropping to reveal the ugly contempt beneath. "You will regret this, you little fool. You have no idea what you're getting into." "No," Ilara said softly. "I think for the first time, I do." After his mother left, a storm of fury and shame in her wake, Julian arrived. He must have seen the lingering tension in the air, the flush on Ilara's cheeks. "My mother was here," he stated, his voice flat. Ilara nodded, sinking onto the sofa. She offered me money to go away. Julian's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped. He closed his eyes for a moment. I am so sorry, Elara. She can be. She's trying to protect you, Elara said wearily. And maybe she's right. This is all crazy. Me, here. You, changing your entire business model. Leo getting attached to me. It's not sustainable. Don't, he said, his voice sharp. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, grounding. Don't let her poison this. What is growing between us? It's the most real thing in my life. You are the most real thing in my life. He looked at her, his winter sky eyes pleading, please don't run. And looking at him, at the vulnerability in the face of a man the world saw as invincible, she knew she couldn't. Not yet. The breaking point came, as it always does, not with a bang, but with a calculated, cruel whisper. Julian, in a grand gesture of defiance against his mother and the world she represented, insisted Elara accompany him to the annual Croft Foundation Charity Gala. It was the pinnacle of Philadelphia's social calendar, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of a historic museum. Elara resisted, knowing she would be a lamb to the slaughter, but Julian was insistent. I want them to see you, he'd said, not as a story, but as the incredible woman you are. I want to stand beside you and have them see us. He'd had a dress delivered, a simple, elegant gown of deep sapphire blue that made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. As she stood before the mirror, she saw not a waitress from Philly, but someone else entirely. Someone polished and poised. It felt like a costume. The gala was a sensory assault. The clinking of crystal, the murmur of 100 conversations, the flash of jewels that could fund a dozen heart surgeries. She felt every eye on her as she walked in on Julian's arm. They were whispers behind champagne flutes, pointed glances, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. She was the curiosity of the season, the billionaire's pet project. Eleanor Croft held court in the center of the room, a magnificent ice queen in silver silk. She greeted Elara with a smile that was pure venom. How brave of you to come, dear. It takes a certain kind of courage to be so out of one's element. Julian's arm tightened around her waist, a protective, possessive gesture. Mother, behave yourself. Darling, I'm always behaved, she purred, before turning her attention to a passing senator. For an hour, Elara survived. She smiled, she nodded, she clutched Julian's hand like a lifeline. But she knew Eleanor was just biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It came when Julian was pulled away by Harrison Thorne to discuss an urgent business matter. Eleanor materialized at her side as if by magic. A word, Miss Vance? In the gardens. The air in here is so thick with ambition. Elara knew it was a trap, but to refuse would be to show weakness. She followed Eleanor out onto a moonlit terrace overlooking the museum's manicured sculpture garden. The cool night air was a relief, but the chill emanating from the woman beside her was far colder. I want you to look out there, Eleanor said, her voice low and conversational. This is my world. It's the world my son was born to command. It is a world of legacy, of power, of alliances forged over generations. It is not a fairy tale. The chill from the marble balustrade seeped through the thin silk of Elara's borrowed dress, a cold reality against her skin. Eleanor Croft's words were not shouts. They were surgical instruments, precisely wielded, each one designed to dissect Elara's fragile hope and expose the insecurities writhing beneath. His absolution. A living, breathing symbol of his penance. The phrases echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the terrace, each one landing like a physical blow. Doubt, a cold and familiar companion from her pre-Julian life, coiled in her stomach. It was a serpent, whispering truths she had desperately tried to ignore. Hadn't she wondered? In the quiet moments in that beautiful, sterile condo, hadn't she questioned the sheer velocity of it all? A man like Julian Croft didn't just fall for a waitress. Men like that acquired, they merged, they leveraged. Was she just his most recent, most sentimental acquisition? Eleanor saw the flicker in her eyes, the slight faltering of her posture, and pressed her advantage. Her voice dropped, becoming a venomous conspiratorial whisper. "I know all about your brother, Michael. Congenital heart defect, a tragic and terribly expensive condition. Julian has already been in contact with Dr. Alistair Finch in Zurich, hasn't he? The best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the world. He's making arrangements, pulling strings that lesser men don't even know exist. He will move heaven and earth to save your brother." She paused, letting the full weight of the statement settle. Zurich. The name itself sounded like money, like an impossible dream Ilara had never even dared to have. "And when he does," Eleanor continued, her smile a triumphant, predatory gleam in the moonlight, "you will owe him a debt you can never truly repay. You will be bound to him, not by love, but by a life. Your brother's life. Is that the foundation you want for your future? An obligation? A transaction? Every man has his price, my dear. It seems my son has found yours. Tell me, is a new heart for your brother the final offer? Or are you holding out for the wedding ring as well?" The cruelty was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of emotional violence, taking the purest, most selfless love in Ilara's life and twisting it into a sordid bargain. For a horrifying second, the floor of the terrace seemed to drop away, leaving her suspended over a chasm of her own self-doubt. The glittering party inside, the city lights beyond, the very ground beneath her feet. It all felt like a lie. Eleanor was right. She was a waitress from a rundown corner of Philadelphia. What was she doing here, draped in sapphire silk, pretending this was anything other than a beautiful, complicated cage? But then, as the serpent of doubt tightened its coils, something else rose up to meet it. It wasn't a sudden surge of anger. It was a quiet, deep, and unshakable certainty, rooted in the very soil of who she was. It was the memory of her father's calloused hands, showing her how to stake a tomato plant, his voice calm and patient. "Things that grow right, Ellie. They have strong roots, can't be knocked over by the first storm." It was the memory of her own hands in the potting soil on the condo's balcony, the feel of life, real and tangible between her fingers. It was the sound of Leo's unrestrained laughter as they'd played a silly card game, a sound so genuine it made the polite titters from the ballroom seem like the chatter of ghosts. It was the image of Julian, not the titan of industry, but the man, kneeling in front of her, the carefully constructed armor of his life shattered, his eyes pleading. "Please don't run." These were not transactions. They were connections. They were roots. Ilara straightened her shoulders, not with defiance, but with a profound, weary calm. The fear had evaporated, burned away by a clarity so intense it felt like a cold fire. She looked at Eleanor Croft, and for the first time, she did not see a formidable matriarch. She saw a profoundly lonely woman, trapped in a fortress of her own making, polishing the bars of her cage because she'd forgotten a world existed outside of it. "You see transactions because that's all you know," Ilara said, her voice devoid of heat, filled only with a strange, aching pity. You look at your son and you see a corporate asset, his value rising and falling with the market. You look at your grandson and you see an heir, a continuation of a bloodline, a legacy to be managed. You look at me and you see a liability on a balance sheet, an unforeseen expense to be mitigated. She took a slow step toward the older woman, her presence suddenly filling the space, forcing Eleanor to take an involuntary step back. You talk about your world, this legacy of yours. It's a world built of glass and steel, of contracts and clauses, but it's so incredibly fragile, isn't it? A single, unplanned act of kindness, a moment of genuine human connection that can't be quantified or controlled, and it threatens to shatter your entire reality. That's what terrifies you. Not me. Not my background. You're terrified that your son might be learning a language you can no longer speak. Ilara's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it cut through the night air like a shard of ice. My brother needs a new heart, yes. But Julian's money can't fix what's broken in your family, Mrs. Croft. It can't buy back the years he's lost with his son, turning a little boy into a silent shadow. It can't build him a heart full of anything but ambition and regret. Only kindness can do that. Only love can do that. And you seem to have spent your entire supply. A sharp, strangled sound came from the arched doorway leading back into the ballroom. Julian stood there, his face a stark, pale mask in the dim light, his grey eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to consume the very air around him. He had heard. He had heard it all. He moved with a deadly, silent grace, walking past Ilara as if she were the only fixed point in a collapsing universe. He stopped directly in front of his mother, and though he didn't raise his voice, the fury radiating from him was a palpable force, a drop in pressure that promised a storm. "You are no longer welcome in my home," he said. The words clipped, precise and utterly final. "You are no longer welcome in my son's life. You will not speak to Ilara again. Ever. Is that understood?" Eleanor stared at him, her mask of regal composure finally cracking, revealing the bewildered rage beneath. "Julian, you cannot be serious. After everything I have done for this family. For this nobody." "This nobody," Julian said, and he turned his head, his gaze finding Ilara's, and in his eyes was an expression of such fierce, protective love that it stole the breath from her lungs. "This nobody has more integrity, more strength, and more class in her little finger than you have accumulated in your entire miserable life. You wanted to know the stakes, Mother. The real stakes." He reached out, his hand finding Ilara's, his fingers lacing through hers, a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos. "Her! She is all that matters." He looked back at his mother one last time, his face carved from granite and grief. "We're leaving." And without a backward glance, he led Ilara away from the glittering party, away from the whispers, and away from the woman who had tried and failed to put a price on her soul. The ride back to the condo was a cocoon of silence, the city lights smearing past the windows like forgotten constellations. The furious energy of the confrontation had dissipated, leaving a heavy, exhausted quiet in its wake. Julian drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Ilara sat beside him, the borrowed sapphire dress feeling like a costume for a play that had ended badly. Eleanor's words, though refuted, still lingered in the air between them, poisonous and sharp. Inside the apartment, the silence stretched, amplified by the panoramic view of a city that was blissfully unaware of the tectonic shifts that had just occurred in their lives. Julian stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. Finally, Ilara broke the quiet. "Was she right?" she asked, her voice small, fragile. Julian turned, his face etched with a pain so profound it seemed to age him. About what? Ilara. Everything she said was poison. Was I your penance? She whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. A project. A way to absolve the guilt you felt for everything? For Leo? For almost bulldozing my life? He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before her, his eyes searching hers, desperate for her to understand. When I first saw you, he began, his voice rough with emotion, in that hospital bed, after you had thrown yourself in front of my son. Yes, the guilt was. It was a physical thing. It was choking me. I thought that by fixing your life, by paying your bills, by taking care of everything, I could somehow balance the scales. It started as a debt, Ilara, a debt I owed you. He reached out, his hands gently cupping her face. But then I sat with you. I talked to you. I watched you with Leo. I saw you bring that barren balcony to life with a few bags of soil and a handful of seeds. You didn't want my money. You wanted my time. You didn't want my power. You wanted my attention. You didn't just absolve my guilt. You showed me what a hollow, empty man I had become. You're not my penance, Ilara. You're my grace. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to trace paths down her cheeks. He wiped them away with his thumbs, his touch infinitely gentle. I love you, he said. The words not a grand declaration, but a simple, elemental truth. Not the idea of you. Not the story of you. You, the woman who knows the difference between a shadow goblin and a distraction, who can talk down a gunman, and who can see life in a patch of dirt. I love you. In that moment, all the lingering poison of his mother's words dissolved, washed away by the raw, unvarnished truth in his eyes. She leaned into his touch, her own heart finally feeling safe enough to break and to heal. The aftermath was, as Ilara had always known it would be, messy and real. The society pages were ablaze with speculation. The Croft Enterprises board, spurred on by a furious Eleanor, called an emergency meeting. Julian faced a full-scale insurrection, a corporate coup orchestrated by his own mother. He spent the next 2 weeks in a state of siege, locked in boardrooms and on conference calls, fighting for control of the empire he had built. But something was different. He fought not with the cold, ruthless aggression of his past, but with a calm, unshakable resolve. He was no longer fighting for market share or quarterly profits. He was fighting for the new life he was building, a life that had Ilara and Leo at its center. During this time, the subject of Michael's surgery remained a tender, unresolved issue. One evening, Julian came home, looking exhausted but triumphant. He'd weathered the storm, he'd secured his position as CEO, albeit with a board that was now watching his every move. He handed Ilara a folder. "It's done," he said, a weary smile on his face. "Dr. Finch in Zurich. He's reviewed Michael's case. He's cleared his schedule. We can be on a plane by the end of the week." Ilara opened the folder. It was filled with flight itineraries, hospital admission forms, and a cost estimate that made her feel dizzy. She looked at Julian, at the love and expectation in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't do it. "No," she said softly, closing the folder and placing it on the table. Julian's smile faded. "What? Ilara, this is the best. There is no one better." "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But your mother was right about one thing. I will not be a debt on your ledger. Not even a debt of love. If our life together is going to be real, it has to be a partnership of equals. And equals don't accept gifts that they can never, ever repay. My brother's life is my responsibility. I need to do this myself." He stared at her, a mixture of frustration and awe on his face. "How? Ilara, be realistic. This kind of money." "I don't know how yet," she admitted, her gaze drifting to the balcony, where the tomato plants were now heavy with small green fruit. "But I will. I'm not the same person I was 2 months ago. I'm not just a waitress waiting for the world to crush her." She looked back at him, her eyes clear and determined. "You taught me to think bigger. So let me." For the next 3 days, she worked. She filled a legal pad with notes, her botanical knowledge mixing with a newfound understanding of the world Julian inhabited. She thought about value, about perception, about need. Late one night, an idea, fragile as a seedling but with the tenacity of a weed, began to take root. The next day, she called Harrison Thorne's office and requested a meeting. Alone. She walked into the Croft Enterprises boardroom, a place of hushed power and intimidating mahogany, wearing not a borrowed gown, but her own simple black dress and a blazer she'd bought from a thrift store. The same board members from the hospital room were assembled, their faces a collective mask of curiosity and hostility. Julian was not present. She had insisted on it. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. "My name is Ilara Vance. 2 months ago, I was serving you coffee. Today I am here to make a proposal. You are men of business. You understand investments and returns. I believe I represent a unique investment opportunity for this company." A murmur of disbelief went through the room. She ignored it. "Your company's public image, its brand identity, is that of a predator," she said, her words blunt and direct. "You are seen as a soulless monolith that tears down communities for profit. The failed plan for the Gilded Spoons block, which is now public knowledge, has only reinforced that perception. You are losing the battle for public opinion, and in the modern market, that is a battle you cannot afford to lose." She laid out her plan. She spoke not of heroism or morality, but of brand rehabilitation, community engagement, and ESG, environmental, social, and governance, metrics, a term she'd learned from Julian. She proposed the creation of a new, independent division of the Croft Foundation, one focused on urban revitalization through therapeutic horticulture. She cited studies on the psychological and physiological benefits of green spaces in urban and medical environments. She proposed creating rooftop gardens on hospitals, community gardens in low-income neighborhoods, and green atriums in corporate plazas, starting with their own. "This is not charity," she said, her passion infusing her words with undeniable authority. "It is a strategic, high-visibility investment in the city where you operate. It generates goodwill that is more valuable than any multi-million-dollar advertising campaign. And I," she finished, her gaze sweeping across their stunned faces, "will run it. Not as Julian Croft's girlfriend, but as its executive director. I will take a salary commensurate with that position, and with that salary, I will pay for my brother's medical care. You will not be giving me a handout. You will be hiring the best person for the job, because no one understands the healing power of this work better than I do." The room was utterly silent. Harrison Thorne, the old lion of the board, stared at her, his shrewd eyes assessing her not as a waitress or a damsel, but as a potential colleague. He saw the fire, the intelligence, and the iron will. He saw a woman who had faced down a gunman and Eleanor Croft, and had not flinched. More importantly, he saw a brilliant solution to a number of their problems, including the erratic behavior of their CEO. "We will consider your proposal, Miss Vance," he said at last, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. We will be in touch." 2 weeks later, Michael was wheeled into surgery at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The operation, performed by a world-class team, assembled and paid for, not by a check from Julian Croft, but by the first substantial salary advance for Elara Vance, the new executive director of the Croft Foundation's Green Futures Initiative, was a resounding success. Her first project was a sprawling, ambitious rooftop garden on that very hospital. She worked tirelessly, her days filled with blueprints, budget meetings, and the glorious feeling of her hands back in the soil. She was a natural leader, inspiring a team of volunteers and staff with her quiet competence and fierce dedication. Months later, on a sun-drenched autumn afternoon, she was on her knees in a raised garden bed, showing a small girl with a chemotherapy port in her chest how to gently transplant a basil seedling. The air smelled of damp earth, lavender, and hope. Her brother Michael, now 15 pounds heavier and with colour in his cheeks for the first time in years, was a few feet away, patiently explaining the principles of composting to a group of teenagers. His easy laughter echoed among the rows of sunflowers standing like sentinels against the skyline. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up. It was Julian and Leo. They were in jeans and sneakers, and Julian was carrying a worn picnic basket. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching her. In his eyes, she saw it all: the love, the pride, the profound wonder. He saw her not as a victim he had saved or a project he had funded, but as a woman in her element, a force of nature in her own right, creating beauty and life with her own 2 hands. Leo broke the spell, running to her and throwing his arms around her neck, heedless of the dirt on her clothes. "We brought sandwiches," he announced to the world. Elara laughed, a sound as bright and clear as the sunshine. She hugged him tight, then looked up at Julian, her smile no longer the tired, practiced thing from the restaurant. It was real, it was radiant, and it was all for him. He walked over and knelt in the rich, dark earth beside her, his $1,000 watch be damned. He took her soil-stained hand in his. Their worlds hadn't collided and merged into one. They had, slowly and carefully, with patience and with love, built an entirely new one together, a world where a man made of granite could learn to be gentle, and a waitress with an aching heart could find the strength to grow a garden in the sky. "What's next?" he murmured, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant oasis she had created. Elara picked up a small trowel and handed it to him. "We plant," she said. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far better. It was the hard, beautiful work of growth. And it was real.